If the flood wiped every giant off the face of the earth, how was one of them still alive, ruling a kingdom, centuries after the waters went down? That question has a piece of evidence, and it's made of iron. There was a bed of solid iron, far too big for any human body. You could lie down in it twice, head to toe, and still have room left over. The Bible records its measurements the way you'd log a piece of evidence, because that's exactly what it was. That bed belonged to one man, a king of Bashan, a giant who was alive and breathing long after the flood was over, and that's where it all breaks. The flood was not a half measure. The Bible says it plainly, with no loophole. Nothing that breathed was left alive. And the giants were not innocent bystanders. They were right at the center of the corruption that brought the waters. They should have been the first ones under, not the last. You've heard the easy explanation. They say Og survived, that he grabbed the outside of the ark and rode out the flood, hanging on while the world drowned. It's an old legend, and a beautiful one, but almost no one stops to ask whether it actually happened. And the real answer isn't in the legend. It's hidden in a tiny phrase near the very start of Genesis that changes the weight of everything. You've almost certainly read right over it and kept going, with no idea what it was holding. But before the phrase, you need to know the man. Because the real story of Og is more disturbing than the legend. He wasn't just another giant, he was the last one, the last of a race the flood should have scrubbed off the earth first. And that's where this investigation begins. So let's meet the man. Og was a king of Bashan, on the east side of the Jordan River. He ruled over the Amorites in a real territory, with cities, with borders, and with people who answered to him. He wasn't a campfire ghost story made up to scare children. He was a flesh and blood ruler with a city to defend and an army to command. And the people of Israel had to deal with him up close, right on the road to the promised land. But there's a word the Bible attaches to his name, and that word changes everything. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 3. The text says Og was what remained of the Rephaim. Rephaim is the name of one of the races of giants that walked that land. And Og wasn't one of them among many. He was the one who was left, the end of the line. Stop for a second here, because this is heavier than it sounds. An entire race once lived on that ground. Men far beyond normal size, with children, with cities, with kingdoms of their own. And out of all of them, by the time the story reaches Og, one is left. A single man, carrying the blood of a people the world had already buried, alone. Picture a massive family tree, packed with branches, packed with names, and every one of those names crossed out, one by one, until a single living leaf is left at the tip of a dead branch. Og was that leaf. And that's where the question tightens again. If Og was the last, it means the others had already fallen, one by one until only he remained, and he was still standing, alive, with a crown on his head, after the flood that should have dragged his entire race to the bottom before anyone else on earth. So measure the size of what we're saying. This isn't some big man who passed through a story and vanished. This is the last living link of a bloodline that should have ended underwater, ruling a kingdom centuries after the waves went down. The whole race should have been gone. And not only did one leftover escape, the leftover became a king. It wasn't supposed to be possible. And yet there it is, written down with a name and a title, in a book that doesn't usually joke around. Now I know what you might be thinking, that this is just an old way of telling stories, an exaggeration from whoever wrote it, a tale that grows in the retelling. That's an honest doubt, and you have every right to raise it. But the Bible doesn't leave you holding that doubt for long, because this time it doesn't ask you to take its word for it. It left a piece of evidence behind, something real, something you could walk up to and measure with your own hand. There's an object tied directly to Og that the text preserved on purpose, his bed, an iron bed with its measurements recorded right there in the same chapter. And it's in that bed that all of this impossibility stops being a story and becomes real metal, with weight and with size. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11. A single line in the middle of a war story, stopping just to describe Og's bed. And the measurement that line gives is absurd. 9 cubits long by 4 cubits wide. A cubit is a very old unit, and it's easy to understand because it came from the body itself. It's the distance from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. That stretch of your arm is 1 cubit. Now line up 9 of them, one after another. That's the length of the bed. 4 of them side by side is the width. Put that into modern measurements and it gets hard to swallow. The length comes out to more than 13 feet. The width is around 6. Lay 3 grown men across it shoulder to shoulder, and there's still mattress left over at the ends. This isn't a bed for a big man, it's a bed for someone who shouldn't exist, and there's a detail that slips right past. The bed was made of iron, not wood. Wood, with that kind of weight on top of it, cracks down the middle. To hold whoever slept there every single night, it had to be forged in metal. And here comes the right question. Why would a book of faith, in the middle of a battle account, slam on the brakes to tell you the dimensions of a piece of furniture? No book does that by accident. That measurement is in the text because it was evidence. It was the kind of detail you write down precisely so someone later can go and measure it for themselves. Now the skeptic raises his hand, and he's right to raise it. There are scholars who say that thing was never a bed at all. It was a sarcophagus, a coffin carved out of basalt, that hard black stone that comes from volcanoes. And a coffin, as you know, is usually made bigger than the body that goes inside it. Extra room on purpose. So the size of the coffin doesn't hand you the exact size of the man. That's an honest objection, and I'm not going to hide it from you. There's a second caveat too, so no one can accuse me of inflating the number. The cubit wasn't an official ruler, the same for everyone. It varied. There was the common cubit and there was the royal cubit, which was longer. Depending on which one the scribe used, the bed stretches or shrinks by a few inches. But look at what's left after you subtract all of that. Grant that it was a coffin, not a bed. Use the smallest cubit there is. Strip away every inch you want to strip. Do all of that, and the object is still far too big for a normal human to fit inside. That's the point no caveat can knock down. Nobody carves a coffin that size to bury a man of ordinary build. The furniture only exists because there was a body that needed it. So Og's body was real, and it was enormous. But his size isn't even the most disturbing part of this story. What truly raises the hair on your arms isn't this man's height. It's the name of his race, a Hebrew word your Bible translated right over, hiding what it carries underneath. And when you find out what it means, the whole case changes its face. The word is this, Rephaim. In your English Bible, it usually just becomes giants, or it shows up untranslated the way it stands. And that's why the chill slips past, because in the original Hebrew, Rephaim doesn't mean giant, it means something far heavier. Rephaim means the dead, the ones who have already died, the shades that go down to the world of the dead. Read that again, slowly, and let it settle. The race of the man with the iron bed wasn't called the big ones or the strong ones, it was called the dead. It's the same word the rest of the Bible uses in other places to talk about the spirits of those who have already departed, down below. You find it with exactly that meaning in Isaiah chapter 26 and in Proverbs. The same word, the dead. And here I'm going to be honest with you. No one knows for certain why a race of living people ended up carrying the name of the dead. Scholars argue about where it came from to this day, but there's one thing that isn't up for debate, what the word means. Rephaim is dead. There's no getting around that. Now put the two ends together, because this is where it gets chilling. You have a race of giants. living people, flesh and bone and blood and height, walking the earth with a king and a kingdom. And their name is the dead, the ones who walk around dead, the dead who won't lie down. Sit with the weight of that. This isn't just some horror nickname slapped on them to frighten people. It's as if the name itself were a sentence, a label saying that these people didn't belong among the living, that their rightful place was under the ground. They were people who carried death in their very name, even standing up, even breathing, and that's exactly where the knot of the iron bed pulls tightest of all. The flood came to do precisely what that name already said, to send the dead back to where the dead belong, to wipe this race off the map once and for all and return every last one of them to silence. The Rephaim were of every creature on earth, the ones with the clearest address at the bottom of the waters. And yet, on the other side of the flood, there's one of them standing, not a shade, not a ghost, a king, alive with a 13-foot iron bed, ruling a kingdom of flesh and blood. A dead man who didn't die. One of the dead who kept walking, centuries after the water washed over everything. So the question stops being a theory and turns sharp as a knife. If his name is dead, and the flood existed to make that name come true, how was this man alive on the outside? How did one of the dead cross over into the world of the living? So now you've got three things in hand: the giant's body, the iron evidence, and the name that should have been erased. All that's missing is the answer. There are three famous explanations for how this dead man crossed the flood. Let's put each one on the stand. Before you hear a single legend, you need to know one word, because it's the word that will judge all the others. When the Bible tells the story of the flood, it uses a specific Hebrew verb for what God was about to do to the earth. The verb is mashah. And mashah doesn't mean kill, it's stronger than that. Mashah means to wipe out, to scrape away, to erase the surface until there's no mark left. It's what you do when you take an eraser to a chalkboard and rub until the name is completely gone, not half erased. You can't read it anymore. Gone. That was the word God chose. I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the earth. Blot out. Not punish, not reduce, not shrink, blot out, and the text leaves no window open. Everything with the breath of life in its nostrils on dry ground was wiped away. That's the standard. Every survival legend that shows up from here on has to pass underneath it. And you're going to see that not one of them does. And it's worth understanding where these legends come from. They weren't born from foolish people. They were born from people who read the exact same problem you're reading right now and couldn't stand to leave a hole that big in the story. So they filled the hole with the best story they could imagine. That deserves respect. But respect is not the same thing as truth. The first legend is the oldest and by far the most beautiful. It comes from the rabbis centuries ago, and it became famous in the voice of one of them, named Rashi. The story goes like this. When the waters began to rise, Og ran to the ark. Too big to fit inside, he grabbed hold of the outside, of a beam, of a rung, and was carried along like that, clinging to the hull while the world went under. And Noah, they say, made a deal with him. Swore to serve Noah forever, and in exchange Noah cut a hole in the side of the ark and passed food out to him every day, keeping the giant alive until the water went down. It's a gorgeous image. It plays out like a whole movie in your head. There's just one problem. It isn't in the Bible. It's rabbinic tradition, written long afterward, and as beloved as it is, it runs straight into the text. Because the text said, Machah, wipe out everything. It didn't say wipe out everything except the giant hanging off the outside. There is no such line. There is no such exception. A man clinging to the wall of the ark was still above the water, still had breath in his nostrils, and the verb spared no one who breathed. The legend is beautiful, but it falls. With all due respect, it falls. The second legend goes a different route. It says Og didn't even need the ark. He was so tall, so enormous, that the floodwater barely came up past his knees. While the entire planet vanished beneath the waves, he supposedly waded across the flooded world on foot, head above all of it, crossing the end of the world on his own 2 feet. In other versions, he built his own way out, a kind of ark of his own, the size of a titan, and rode the flood out alone. And here the same thing happens. It doesn't matter how tall he was. The text didn't measure anyone's height before it wiped them out. It said everything, and it was specific about the size. The water rose 15 cubits above the highest peak, more than 20 feet of water standing over the tallest mountain that existed. There's no giant's knee higher than that, and there's no crack anywhere in the text for a survivor who managed on his own. Machar again. The second legend falls right alongside the first, and now you feel the real squeeze. Because if it wasn't clinging to the ark, and it wasn't above the water, and the text won't open an exception for either one, it looks like we've hit a dead end. The 2 famous explanations are on the floor. And this is exactly the point where most channels do one of 2 things. Either they leave you hanging with no answer at all, or they invent a third legend, even crazier, to plug the hole. I'm not going to do either one, because the problem, this whole time, wasn't a missing answer. It was that the question was wrong. We've spent this entire video asking how Og survived the flood, and maybe he simply didn't. Maybe the right answer isn't in how he escaped the water. It's in that small phrase back near the start of Genesis that changes the whole question. The phrase is in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, and it's tiny, so short it gets lost in the middle of a larger verse, one that talks about the giants and the sons of God. Most people read the whole verse in one go and never stop on those words. But pay attention to them now. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, and also after that. Read it again. The Bible itself, in the same breath where it talks about the giants from before the flood, warns you that they showed up again afterward. It doesn't say some escaped. It doesn't say one held onto the ark. It says there were giants in those days, and there were giants once more on the other side of the waters. The text never hid the answer. It was right there in 4 words the whole time. And maybe you feel a different kind of chill now. The chill of someone who always suspected there was more underneath this story and just watched the piece snap into place. So look at what that changes. Og didn't cross the flood. He didn't have to. The bloodline of the giants didn't survive clinging to a boat. It came back. It came back through the same channel that produced the first ones, back in Genesis 6, before the water ever rose. The same mechanism happened again after the flood was over and bred a fresh crop of them on dry ground. Og isn't a dead man who escaped death. He's a new link in an old chain, forged on this side already. The iron bed doesn't tell you he crossed the water, it tells you the giants came back. Exactly how they came back is a long story, with more than one serious theory. The phrase in Genesis 6 points to the same kind of origin as the first ones, repeated on the far side of the flood. But that's a subject for an entire video, and this isn't it. For now, what matters is the thing the text leaves no doubt about. The race did not end in the waters. It continued. And now the part that sets this channel apart from almost everything else. The moment to say, in plain words, what is Bible and what is a story told on top of it. The legend of Og, clinging to the ark with Noah passing food through the hole, is tradition. It comes from Rashi, from the Talmud, from brilliant rabbis who came along much later. It's beautiful, it's ancient, but it is not scripture. There's even a broken text from the Dead Sea Scrolls that keeps these giant stories alive, Og among them. But it's apocryphal, fragmented, incomplete, and outside the Bible. It proves the fascination is ancient. It does not prove the giant floated through the flood. And maybe you're wondering why I keep hammering on this. It's because the easiest thing in the world, with this subject is to walk away believing the legend of the Ark is written in Scripture. It isn't, and I'd rather hand you a truth that's a little less magical than let you repeat, with your head held high, something the Bible never said. So take all of it off the table. Take Rashi off, take the Talmud off, take the Dead Sea Scrolls off, take every beautiful legend off, and look at what's left, because what's left is bedrock. The bed exists, and it's in Deuteronomy 3. The battle exists, and it's in Numbers and in Deuteronomy. The Rephaim were walking the land in Abraham's day, centuries after the flood, and that's in Genesis 14. And the phrase that explains all of it, and also after that, is in Genesis 6. None of this is invention, none of this is tradition. It's the text from start to finish. And that's where the mystery of the iron bed finally rests. Og was real. He was a giant. He was alive long after the flood. All of that still stands, intact. What falls isn't the giant. It's the legend that he escaped. He never escaped anything. He was simply born afterward, from a race that should have stayed at the bottom, and came back anyway. The question that opened this video had an answer the whole time, and it was never inside an ark. It was in 4 words of Genesis, but knowing where Og came from still isn't the end of his story. You know where Og came from now, but he's still out there, alive, ruling, with the iron bed still in his chamber. The bloodline came back, and it has a king. The story of a giant like that only ends one way, and it isn't in bed. Take the road that climbs toward Bashan. The people of Israel are on it, after years dragging their feet through the desert, finally close to the land that was promised. And it's right there, on the road, that the shadow of Og appears. The land of Bashan was high plateau and black stone, the kind of ground that looks built for a giant to live on. When the army of Israel reaches its edge, they aren't walking into just any territory. They're stepping into the backyard of the last of the Rephaim. And he didn't hide behind a wall. He didn't wait to be surrounded. The last giant in the world gathered all his people, all his army, and marched out to meet Israel head-on at a place called Edrei. And here you have to feel the size of the fear this man pushed out ahead of him, because Israel had seen a giant before. A generation earlier, the spies had come back from the promised land white with terror, talking about enormous men, saying they felt like grasshoppers next to them. That fear cost them dearly. It cost 40 years going in circles through the desert, an entire generation that died without ever setting foot inside because they froze in front of the giants. And now, right at the door of the land, who shows up on the road? Not just any giant, the last of them all, the biggest name the race had left, the king of the dead who walked, with an army at his back and a lifetime without losing a single war. Imagine standing in the front row that day. You're a man of ordinary height with a spear in your hand, and across the field comes a creature who looks down at you like you're a child. His shadow covers entire rows of men at once. You know the name that race carries, and you know you're facing, spear in fist, a dead man who won't lie down. If this man won that battle, it wasn't just one more defeat. It was the end. The promise died right there, crushed under the foot of the last of the Rephaim. Everything, the whole journey, the whole ordeal, came to a stop at the body of Og. And it's inside all of that dread that one sentence arrives, short, almost too small for the size of the threat. God speaks to Moses, and what he says is in Numbers, chapter 21, verse 34. 3 words. Fear him not. Look at those 3 words against the size of the problem. On one side, a mountain of flesh with centuries of victories behind it. On the other, fear him not. Not run. Not pray and hope for the best. It's don't be afraid because this is already over, you just haven't seen it yet. Because the sentence finishes, I have already delivered him into your hand. The battle was decided before it began. The giant just didn't know it yet. Then the two forces collide at Edrei, and you can almost hear it. The ground shaking as the army of an entire kingdom advances, the war cry rising from both sides. And in the center of it all, one head above all the others, the last giant on earth, spinning, knocking men down, walking into the fight certain that he was still too big to fall. But with every blow he landed, Israel's grip tightened, because that time they weren't fighting alone. And 40 years of fear got poured out, all of it, onto that one giant body. And the text doesn't make a show of it. It doesn't drag the scene out. It tells you what happens with a coldness that's almost more frightening than any description. Israel struck Og. They struck his sons. They struck all his people until none were left. None. And then silence. The noise stops. The dust settles. And where the last giant in the world had been standing, there's nothing left but a body on the ground and an army breathing hard, slowly realizing what just happened. The boogeyman of their stories, the terror that had broken an entire generation, is down in the dust of Edrei, and he isn't getting up. The last living leaf of that dead tree came loose from the branch. The man with the iron bed, the king of the dead who walked, the name that should have vanished in the waters and came back anyway, was put down for good. And with him went the last drop of that ancient blood. The race that began before the flood ended that afternoon. And here's where the story closes the circle in a way that gives you chills. Think about everything they said about him. That he'd escaped the flood, that he'd clung to the ark while the world drowned, that he was too tall for the water to take. Every one of those legends exists to say one single thing, that Og was too big to die. And in the end, he dies. Not to a flood that covered the planet, to a sword, on an ordinary afternoon, in a battle like any other. The giant who, in the legend, escaped the water, did not escape the iron. The race that came back from the dead came back only to die again, and this time it stayed down. So let's answer, out loud, the question in the title of this video. Does the iron bed prove that Og survived the flood? No, it does not. The bed proves something different and far more unsettling. It proves that Og existed after the flood. And since no giant crossed those waters, only one explanation is left. Their race wasn't wiped out. It came back. The giants didn't survive the end of the world. They were born again on this side of it. That's what that 13-foot bed holds in silence. Not the story of one lone survivor clinging to an ark, but the proof that what the waters tried to erase found a way to grow back on dry ground, as if the flood had never happened. One giant went under in the waters, and another was born to take his place. And that's exactly the chill that's left at the end. Not the chill of a monster who escaped one time, but of a bloodline that refuses to die. You erase it and it comes back. You drown the whole world, and it sprouts again in the first dry ground it finds. The iron bed was never about a giant who ran from the water. It was about a race that wouldn't stay buried. Og was one link in that chain, but he wasn't the only one, and he wasn't by a long shot the most famous. And that giant, you know, Goliath, the one with the sling and the stone, but his story is far bigger than the boy who brought him down. Goliath is the most famous piece of the very same bloodline we investigated today. The best-known proof that the blood of the giants crossed the end of the world. Remember when I told you, in the middle of this video, that how that race came back was a subject for an entire video? That video is on your screen right now. It's the full investigation of how the bloodline crossed the flood and ended up standing on a battlefield 1,000 years later. Click it the moment this one ends. And tell me one thing in the comments. To you, is the legend of Og, clinging to the ark, a tradition worthy of respect or an invention that confuses people's faith? Pick a side and tell me why. And if you made it to the end and you understood what that iron bed really proves, leave one word for me down below: Edrei.